I'd like to welcome everybody to today's presentation on grief and trauma, processing the aftermath of tragedies. I'm your host, Dr. Dawn-Elise Snipes. Today we will be discussing how to help people understand and cope with their reactions to various types of traumas and tragedies. So if that is going to be triggering, this may not be the video for you. In this presentation, we're going to review what trauma is, explore what we call emotional salience and how people can be traumatized and grieve over things they have not personally experienced, explore losses that need to be grieved besides death, and discuss the impacts of losses and trauma on all pieces of life and strategies to help people heal. For those of you who are new to the channel, let's talk about real briefly what trauma is. Trauma is a state of feeling unsafe and powerless. You don't have to have PTSD to feel traumatized. When you feel unsafe and powerless, that can be defined as something traumatic happening. After you're in a car accident, that's traumatic. Even if, it was a little more than a fender bender, but not much, it's still sort of traumatic. And you may feel anxious before you get in the car again. When we experience a loss of some sort, especially if it's unexpected, it can be traumatic. If you have the sudden death of a pet or a friend, or even the sudden loss of your job, that can be traumatic. It's like, oh crap, how am I going to pay my bills? What am I going to do? I feel unsafe and powerless because something that was integral to my life, think of Maslow's hierarchy, that bottom level where you have food, shelter, and clothing, that's in jeopardy now. Our experiences continually shape and reshape the way we perceive ourselves, others, and the world. We talk a lot about schema, and those are our mental shortcuts that we develop that help us anticipate what's going to happen. When I'm driving and I come up to a yellow light, I expect it to turn red. If it flashes, I know what to do with that now. But initially I was like, what's going on here? Didn't compute. I had to change. I had to reshape the way I perceived that particular stimulus. So I knew that sometimes traffic lights flash yellow. We also change how we perceive ourselves. If we start feeling ashamed of ourselves, if we start feeling guilty about something, or if we start thinking that we are the next best thing to cupcakes, it changes based on our experiences. And as people have lots of successes, they may start thinking that they're, all that. While the intensity of the traumatic reaction may differ between those directly involved and onlookers, it can still be perceived as traumatic. And we're going to talk about why that is. Experiences have varying effects based on what we call their emotional salience, their weight. What does it mean to me? Emotional salience is determined in part by your similarity to the victim or the perpetrator, or the similarity of important others in your life. We just saw a tragedy on the subway where a young girl was murdered. And a lot of us can look at that young girl and see our daughters. We can see our sisters. We can see, people that we love, and we can see it happening to them. And it's shocking and traumatic. And similarity to prior experiences. I'm going to share a little bit about me, probably more than you want to know, but it helps drive home the point. When I was a young child, I was a survivor of a home invasion. And came through that, whatever. Then, lo and behold, I was at the University of Florida when Danny Rawling went on his spree. And what did he do? The home invader, in my case, broke in through the sliding glass door. Danny Rawling broke in through the sliding glass doors. So even though I wasn't directly experiencing it, it was reminding me of the terror, of the feeling. So it was reopening old wounds. It was similar to something I'd gone through before, and my brain was kind of going, oh crap. Proximity to your safe zones or places similar to your safe zones. So let's stick with Rawling for right now. That happened on the University of Florida campus. When we go to college, or it used to be, I don't know what it's like now, used to be when we went to college, it felt like it was our neighborhood. It felt like it was a safe place, and we'd be out jogging with our headphones at 10 o'clock at night and not a care in the world. We felt safe. Even though there was no barrier wall around it, we felt safe. And when that started happening, we didn't feel safe. When things happen on other college campuses, whether it's, whatever, tragedies happen on other college campuses, it reminds us that those campuses aren't safe. And if you are still on campus for some reason, maybe you are a professor, then it drives that home. It's like, oh, I'm on a campus every single day. So it can be more traumatic, more anxiety-provoking, more stressful for people who are in similar situations, even if not at the same exact place. And your perceived responsibility. When we have tragedies, there are certain things that we perceive we are more responsible for. As a parent, if I'm sending my child to school and something bad happens, we had tornadoes come through here, about 7 years ago, and they destroyed several schools. Now, thankfully, none of the kids were in the schools, but if they had been, that would have been devastating. And as a parent, I would have felt, rightly or wrongly, or logically or illogically, whatever you want to say, I would have felt responsible for putting my child in harm's way. And that goes to that emotional reasoning. Logically, I had no way of predicting there was going to be a tornado, but emotionally, Mama Bear comes out. Airplane crashes. I was watching a show last night, and there was an airplane crash, and one of the main characters in the show was very distressed. And she said, that's the flight that I take like every other week to go home and see my husband, because they were, commuting. And she's like, that could have been me. And so it hit her a lot harder seeing all of these people, partly because that's a flight that she takes. So we want to recognize that there are a lot of what we call discriminative stimuli. There are a lot of things about certain situations that make us feel connected to, or make it easier for us to empathize or put ourselves in the shoes of someone who experiences a tragedy. And the more of those we have, the more salient it is, the more it's like, well, it could have been me. And the more we tend to have our stress response triggered. Empathy and compassion are normal human emotions. I mean, think of it. When you watch those ASPCA commercials, which I don't watch because they make me too sad, but when you look into the eyes of those freezing cold, starving little puppies, it hurts your heart. It makes you want to do something. It makes you want to get control back, to stop the suffering. And when we see suffering, our natural human emotion is to try to get control back, because that feels unacceptable and out of our control. We feel unsafe and powerless. Shriners Hospitals, we see those commercials. You see, I watch a lot of TV, but those commercials come on, and you see these young children who are struggling with diseases, and you can't help but have compassion for them. You can't help but have your heart hurt and be moved to action, because it could be your child, your grandchild. And you can see most of us have either had children or have been around children, and it tugs at our heartstrings, which is impactful. And that's what they count on in these commercials. After a disaster, whether, I remember Hurricane Katrina, seeing people wading through the water and seeing dogs paddling as hard as they could, broke my heart. And it made me want to do something. And one of the things that we need to recognize is we have compassion for those people. And in order to be motivated to do something, we have to in some way empathize with that suffering. You don't have to be there to experience grief or trauma. I remember when I was little, my mother was, I think she was in 6th grade when it happened, when JFK was assassinated. And she remembers it. She was home from school that day. She was sick. She remembers it like it was yesterday. I remember the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan because, that was a big deal and everybody felt it. Because what happens if the leader of your country is suddenly incapacitated? That makes you feel unsafe and powerless. It's like, crap, what's going to happen? Not to mention the fact that you empathize with the person and with their families and whatever. And especially public figures like JFK and Martin Luther King Jr., you heard them so much. They were talking to you. And this was before social media. This was before podcasts when they were in your ear like every single day. But you heard them so much, you felt like you knew them. And so when this happens, it feels like you're losing a friend. It feels like it's something that's happening to your BFF. 9/11, again, I remember that clearly. And just feeling like I got punched in the gut and watching it. School shootings, Charlie Kirk, Irina Zarutska. I mean, the list goes on. Just because a trauma is not mentioned here doesn't mean it's not important. I'm just trying to give you a range of things. Not everybody empathizes with everything. And okay, if something happened and you're like, whatever, well, it doesn't have a lot of emotional salience for you. Or maybe it has the opposite type of emotional salience, so you're not bothered and distressed by it. Okay, that is your right to your thoughts, to your feelings. On the other side, we need to respect the rights of the thoughts and feelings of people who are bothered by it. And we are going to start seeing a lot more of this in the counseling rooms. We are going to see more of this in couples counseling as well, especially when you have couples that are a lot different in their upbringing and their political values in whatever. It can cause some strain and stress, and helping people figure out how to navigate this and respect one another's beliefs, values, and boundaries is going to be huge. PTSD. Now, I did my dissertation on post-traumatic stress and trying to identify in emergency service personnel who's more likely to develop PTSD and negative consequences from traumatic events. So this is kind of in my wheelhouse, obviously. Pinus and Nader, and I don't know what their first names were, but if you Google Pinus and Nader, you will come up with a litany of articles they wrote long before I was doing any research on traumatic stress and PTSD triage and all the stuff we're talking about today. But I digress. PTSD is more likely to develop in people who have high emotional salience with the event. If the event happens and you're like, my mother's last husband didn't like animals. He wasn't raised around animals. He didn't think they belonged in the house, whatever. Okay, that's your right. I don't understand it, but that's your right. If an animal died, or he saw an animal injured, he was like, whatever, it's a dog, and would go on about his day. For me, I would see that and I would be, trying to catch the injured animal, and it would be devastating. I felt differently about it because I've been raised with animals. I've had them in my life for literally as long as I can remember. So it is important to recognize that people with high emotional salience are going to have stronger reactions. They were either involved in it, they were there, or they really identified with it because it was close to their home place, which is where they're supposed to be safe. It was close to their safe space, or they had a lot of similarity with the victim or the situation, and or they felt some element of responsibility to either stop it or address it once it happened. Like after hurricanes, people often feel this urge to help. And when they don't help, they start feeling really guilty and may start getting angry that other people aren't helping. Okay, so high emotional salience, low resilience quotient. What do I mean by that? Resilience is our ability to bounce back. And if we don't have good tools to bounce back after stress, any kind of stress, if we are worn down, if we're burned out, if we're exhausted, we don't have a good resilience quotient. This is true for any type of stress. So if you've got somebody who is physically worn down because they just had open heart surgery or they've got a chronic medical condition or something, they may have lower resilience than other people. But that's okay. We all are where we are and how we are, and it is what it is. So we want to recognize that if somebody was already in a vulnerable state, they had a low resilience quotient, and they had high emotional salience, they're getting ready to get, kind of walloped by this tsunami of a stressor. If they have a trauma history, especially one that is unresolved, it can be more impactful. Now, if they have a trauma history, like I told you, I had my trauma history, I want to believe that I had it mostly resolved, but it still felt for a minute like I was right back there. For people who haven't resolved their trauma history, for people who already have PTSD from something else, it is going to be just another insult. And it's often an exponential insult because they were already feeling unsafe and powerless, and now they feel way more unsafe and powerless. The last one is a low level of social support in 24, 48, 72 hours. Why are there three numbers? 24 hours is when it's still fresh. It's basically in your short-term memory. You may not have even gone to sleep yet. So it's still there, and your brain doesn't know what to do with it. It has absolutely no file to stick this in. So what do I do with it? Social support in the first 24 hours has been found to be extremely helpful at empowering people to regain their sense of stability, getting back into a routine as quickly as possible, and just validating how they feel, where they are, and then helping them figure out, okay, now what next? How are we going to put one foot in front of the other? It's empowering to feel like, okay, I can do this. At 48 hours, it may not be quite as fresh. The person may have already started to make some semblance of understanding of it, but it's not a schema yet. It's not committed to memory. And there's a lot that can be done in that first 48 hours to help people better interpret what's going on from a fact-based perspective instead of an emotional-based perspective. After 72 hours, the person needs to do something with that. They can't just keep playing it over in their head and dwelling on it and ruminating and everything else. So they try to make some sense of it and file it somewhere. It may not be where it stays forever, but after 72 hours, those beliefs about what happened are starting to become more ingrained. And whether those beliefs are one of safety and empowerment or lack of safety and and helplessness really set the tone for what the next few weeks are going to look like. Remember that behavior is communication. If somebody experiences or is exposed to a trauma and they become irritable, okay, well, you know what? Behavior's communication. That tells me they're feeling vulnerable and their stress response is triggered. So they are reacting from fight or flight as opposed to necessarily from their wise mind. During this period, when people are feeling vulnerable, it's even more important to respect their boundaries, because when their boundaries are violated, it makes them feel unsafe. It makes them feel vulnerable. It makes them feel powerless. Physical boundaries, getting physically close to somebody. Maybe they don't want to be touched right now. Maybe they do. Have to ask. But respecting those physical boundaries. Interpersonal boundaries. Respecting who the person wants to socialize with and respecting their concept of themselves, their self-esteem and their self-efficacy. Maybe they feel guilty right now and they feel bad about themselves, or they feel helpless, which is the opposite of feeling efficacious. All right, that's how you feel right now. It's not for me to disagree with you, because that is your reality. Emotionally, we need to empathize and validate. Now remember, empathy. You don't want to get stuck down in the well. But sympathy is when somebody gets stuck down in a cold well. It's wet, it's cold, it's dark, it's miserable. Sympathy is when you lean over and go, must suck down there. But you're not really experiencing it. It doesn't take a lot of energy, and you don't really know. Or maybe the person down in the well is like, you won't believe how cold it is down here. I'm freezing. And you're standing up there going, it's not really that cold. You're just imagining things. All right, so that's sympathy. It is harder if you're not actually sort of in that person's shoes a little bit to really understand what they're going through. You will never completely understand what a person's going through because you haven't had all of their prior experiences. But you can get a better understanding if you try to empathize. Now, empathy with that same person in the well is strapping on rappelling gear and going down in the well and going, oh yeah, you're right. It's about 20 degrees colder down here. I can see why you say it's freezing. And I can see, now that I'm down in here, I can see why you feel like the walls are closing in on you. I didn't understand that from up there. I get a better perspective of what you're going through right now. And okay, so now that I understand, let me go back up to the surface and see what we can do. And maybe I'll send down a blanket and some lights so it's brighter down there, whatever. But I'm not stuck in the well. If you have poor boundaries, you may get stuck empathizing. That's like just jumping down into the well with the person. That doesn't do either one of you any good. Put on that rappelling gear. Go down. Figure out, try to understand a little bit more about where they're coming from. And then pull yourself back out and decide what happens next. That's where validation comes from, or comes next. Because our reality, if I'm standing up on top of the surface, my reality is very different than theirs. I'm going to validate their personal experience because it's not mine, but it is theirs. And we need to recognize that everybody has their own unique personal experience that is shaped by, one, what we call reality, and two, their perception of reality based on their prior experiences. Cognitively, we want to respect their boundaries. Again, how they think, their perception of things is how they think and their perception of things. Unfortunately, we are far too quick to jump on people on social media when they express differing opinions. And I may not agree with certain opinions. I may not agree with certain people's beliefs, but that doesn't mean I have the right to tell them how to think. And a lot of beginning counselors really struggle with this because they're like, well, this person is wrong, so I need to convince them that their perspective is wrong and my perspective is right. And I'm like, no, not our job. When you have somebody come into your counseling practice, for example, from a different religion, and maybe they believe things totally different than what you believe, is it your right? And the answer is no. It is not your right to tell them that their beliefs are wrong. The same thing applies for everything else in the world. Everyone is entitled to their own beliefs as long as they're not hurting somebody else. And that's, just common decency. If you are, if I believe I have the right to go down the road and punch people in the face, obviously that's not okay. It's hurting other people. If I believe I have the right to walk down the street and scowl at people and not say anything to them, well, that's my right. I'm not hurting them. I'm certainly not making any friends, but I'm not hurting them. And we need to respect environmental boundaries. We need to respect their stuff. When people start feeling like they are going to lose some of their stuff after a tragedy, they're already feeling vulnerable. They're already feeling disempowered. And then you start talking about taking my stuff, taking things that are important to me. Oh, That's, I'm setting a line there because that's one thing I feel like I can control. Behavior is communication. All of the ways people react after a tragedy are often centered around regaining a sense of safety and personal empowerment and trying to reorganize their understanding of themselves, others, and the world. Now, death is not the only loss that can be traumatic and must be grieved. Physical losses, obviously, death is one of them. We can lose our life. That's traumatic. Other people or animals, pets can lose their life. That's traumatic. But it's also traumatic we lose our abilities. If you're in a car accident and suddenly you can't see anymore, that's traumatic. And you're going to grieve the loss of that ability that you had. Or if you suddenly are diagnosed with a chronic illness or a terminal illness, you're going to grieve that. When other people are diagnosed, I remember when Toby Keith was diagnosed with stomach cancer. Oh my gosh, because y'all know that my family has dropped off in droves from cancer. We haven't met a cancer we didn't like, which is terrifying to me. So then every time I hear of somebody developing cancer, it kind of reopens that wound and it's a little bit traumatic. Now, was I completely devastated and bedbound? Of course not. But it was like, oh, wow, it's still there. You feel unsafe and powerless because somebody as rich as Toby Keith couldn't get the medical treatment necessary to stave off cancer. Interpersonal, you can lose the ability to trust others. If something is committed, if a tragedy or something is committed by somebody, then you may start being suspect of everybody. It's like, okay, is that person safe? Is that person safe? Likewise, after a tragedy, maybe it's a natural disaster. If other people don't behave the way you expect them to, then it changes your understanding of the world. It's like, why aren't people running to try to help everybody? Where is the support? Where is the love? Where is the brotherhood? And you may start wondering, well, if that happened to me, maybe I'd be on my own and, as my mother used to say, shit out of luck. So the ability to trust others starts coming into question, and that can make you really anxious because most of us recognize that it takes a village. We can't do it just on our own. The desire to engage with others. Well, when you are worn out, when you're burned out, when you're stressed out, and when you may not be able to trust other people, yeah, you're probably not going to want to engage with others. And that may be something that you grieve, because it's like, I used to like going out with people, and now I'd rather stay home with my dog. Self-esteem and self-efficacy. We can lose those. We can start feeling bad about ourselves. We can start feeling unable to keep ourselves safe. We can start feeling unable to protect those we love. And that can grate on our sense of identity. If we've always prided ourselves on being protectors, and then suddenly we feel like we are not able to, it changes things. Other losses that people may experience after a tragedy, when we are stressed, exhausted, depressed, etc., it is difficult to feel happy and curious. Those take a lot of energy, and it can be really frustrating when you are 2, 3, 4 weeks or even months out from a tragedy and you're just not feeling happy. Some people don't feel at all. They're not having the big lows, but they're not having the happiness or the curiosity or the motivation either. And that is really difficult for a lot of people to manage. Cognitively, after a loss, we often experience, or after a tragedy, we often experience a decline in our cognitive abilities. What do I mean by that? I mean that it's difficult to think. It is difficult to plan. It is difficult to engage those executive functioning things, because we are still in some level of fight or flight. Now remember, when we're in fight or flight, we're not in think and process. They're disengaged. And when we are still reeling from a stressor, it is much harder to think accurately and clearly, and we tend to get stuck in emotional mind. Our beliefs about ourselves, others, and the world are challenged, and we need to alter them in some way. And our dreams for the future can also be impacted if, for example, we dreamed of a future of peace and happiness and prosperity and blah, blah, blah. You know, there's much more dystopian outlook now. So people need to figure out, okay, what can I do with that? What do I do with that? Environmentally, people may experience feelings of, they may have difficulty experiencing feelings of safety in the environment because they're exposed to triggers as a result of the trauma, as a result of people's reactions after a trauma. They may have difficulty coping with the loss of their stuff, or it maybe remind them of when they lost their stuff after a tornado or a flood. People lose a lot of stuff. And spiritually, people may lose a sense of meaning and connection. It's like, okay, this is not how it's supposed to be in my world. I don't know how to connect with other people. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know what I'm supposed to be freaking doing anymore. When we experience a loss or trauma, it creates what we call cognitive dissonance. It doesn't compute. And this makes people feel more vulnerable and powerless, because I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to predict what's going to happen next, because that wasn't supposed to happen. So is everything I believe about myself and others in the world wrong? What do I do with that? When we're in that place, it disengages the logical mind from the emotional mind. It triggers that stress response. Unless processed, memories of the event are often based in emotional reasoning and other cognitive distortions, including all or nothing thinking. I'm either safe or I'm unsafe. People are either good or people are bad. There's no in between. Catastrophizing. All hope is lost. I can never be happy again. I'll never feel safe anywhere again. Overgeneralization. All people are fill in the blank. And I have people in brackets because it may be different types of people. Like all police officers are, good or bad or whatever you want to say. So it may be a group of people, but one person or a few people are generalized into the whole group, which makes it feel a lot more dangerous. If there's 5 bad actors, okay, I could deal with that. If there are 5,000 bad actors, oh my gosh, then I feel very unsafe. And mind reading. When people start thinking, well, you fit this profile, so I know you're thinking this way. You fit this profile, so I know you must believe this. That's dangerous. And we are not allowing people to express themselves. We are actually violating their boundaries when we mind read because we are assuming we know what they're going to say and basically putting words in their mouth. Again, behaviors communication. Are they saying I'm angry and I'm afraid and I'm trying to regain a sense of control so I can feel safe? Are they saying I'm sad and I feel helpless and hopeless and I don't know what to do? Is their behavior saying I'm confused and trying to make sense of this? It really comes down to only a few basic things, but people express these thoughts or needs in various forms of behavior. When we experience a loss or a trauma, it prioritizes in our own mind awareness of perception and threats. When we're in fight or flight, when that stress response is triggered, we pay attention to all the negative things. And we may even interpret the world through a trauma-based lens. So even things that may be neutral, we perceive as more threatening. It may reopen old wounds and old traumas. It causes us to reorganize our beliefs to include the current information. And I talked about stoplights before. Assimilation, and this is Piaget, you can go back to look at his stuff. When we assimilate information, we fit new information into existing frameworks. So we have to make sense of it based on our expectations. In accommodation, we alter the framework to fit the new information. So if there's a flashing yellow light in assimilation, my framework says it always goes red. So I say to myself, well, that light must be broken. There can't be any other explanation for it because in my world, yellow always turns red. In accommodation, I'm going to change my expectations. Now I'm learning, well, yellow does turn to red most of the time, except around fire stations and during low traffic times. Okay, so now I know that I can expect sometimes to see a flashing yellow light. After an act of violence or a disaster, when we assimilate, other people, our framework says other people are generally safe and well-meaning. I'm not going to change my framework, so how do I make sense of what happened? This must be a rogue actor. Or maybe it's fake news. It didn't happen at all. This is something that's just fake. Or maybe it's misunderstood. Maybe whatever happened wasn't what we actually think it was. But if people are generally safe and well-meaning, then this couldn't have happened, and it just couldn't. Accommodation, we have to change our beliefs. Other people must not be generally safe and well-meaning. So who is safe? Now, kind of like that flashing yellow light, we have to decide what are the conditions under which people are not safe. How do I tell the safe from the unsafe? And this can activate a lot of blame and anger in people when they are trying to figure out who is safe. And there can be a lot of overgeneralization that is so detrimental. So let's talk about reasons and interventions for post-trauma reactions. Physical. Autonomic nervous system dysregulation. Well, your sympathetic nervous system, your stress response is going to be in high gear. Your relaxation response isn't going to be able to keep up. It's not going to be able to say, okay, we can just chill for now, we're safe. Well, because you don't feel safe. So then that sympathetic nervous system starts becoming stronger and more dominant, which means we've got more inflammation, more irritability, more sleep disturbances, more GI disturbances, which takes us to sleep disturbances. When we're not feeling safe, when we're not feeling empowered, when our stress response is activated, we don't sleep well. Even if we're sleeping, we're not sleeping well. We may be restless. It's hard to sit still. Well, that's the natural stress response. You don't want to be caught resting on your laurels. You want to be ready to spring into action to defend yourself, which is exhausting. You're going to start feeling fatigued from sleep disturbances and from muscle tension. You're going to start feeling muscle aches and fatigue from muscle tension, being primed to jump into action. GI distress, very common, because our gut microbiome changes in response to stress. And we also have changes in the way we process our food because our body's spending less time in rest and digest and more time in fight or flee. And all of this increases inflammation and autoimmune flares. Interpersonally, we start seeing the stress response. Now remember, it's not just fight or flight. It's fight, flight, fawn, that I'm going to do whatever it is to make myself safe. Freeze, oh crap, I don't know what to do. I'm not fighting, I'm not fleeing, I'm not fawning. I want to do something, but I don't know. And then flop is, I give up. I don't have the energy to even care. Screw it. And people react differently based on their level of resilience. A lot of people don't go to flop until they're completely burned out. But the fight, flight, fawn, or freeze is often based on their expectations for what's going to happen and whether they can succeed. I'm not going to fight somebody who is, 6'5" and 250 pounds. No, I'm going to flee from that. So we make our choices about, is this something I'm going to fight? Am I going to flee? Or how am I going to react? Fawn and freeze are often learned responses, more so fawn than freeze. Freeze is when you're like, okay, I don't know if I can fight or if I can flee or what the best choice is to be safe. And you just kind of end up stuck. When the trauma is caused by another person, it is common to have difficulty trusting others. It's important that we help people stop and examine the FITCAT, facts in this context at this time. Is this person safe? Do we actually know what this person is thinking about? I talked with my cousin the other day, and I have no idea what his political leanings are, what his religious beliefs are, or anything. I know what my aunt and uncle's leanings were, but I don't know what his are. But that didn't matter. We were talking about, how are you doing? How are you coping? And it's important to not assume what somebody else is thinking and to ask, what are your thoughts? What are your feelings? What's going on? And so you can start to develop a sense of trust that they're not going to invade your boundaries and tell you how to think or how to feel. And likewise, that, you're not going to do that to them. We have to rebuild trust with one another. It's common to overgeneralize feelings about the perpetrator to others who resemble the perpetrator in appearance, word, or deed. If you've had a bad experience with a doctor, for example, then you may think that all doctors are bad. I don't want to go to them. They're all, bad. Cops, Christians, conservatives, liberals, the list can go on about we have preconceived notions that we need to get away from and not assume that everybody who is like this believes this or acts this way or is safe or is unsafe. We need to look at the facts in this context at this time. What do we know about this person? And recognize if we're having some projection issues, we're feeling unsafe because they remind us of somebody in the past who was unsafe. All right, that's a natural reaction, but we also need to check it and recognize that that doesn't mean this person is necessarily unsafe. For children, I do want to bring up that kids may not understand what happened, but if it's consuming their caregivers 24/7, it often causes the children to feel unsafe or even abandoned. It's like, caregiver hasn't been out of bed for 3 days, or all they talk about is this thing that's going on here. I'll admit, I was kind of glued to the TV for a day or two after 9/11. And of course, I met my son's needs at that point, but I was not nearly as emotionally or cognitively available for him as I was, all the rest of the time. And it's important if this trauma goes on for a while, that we recognize how it impacts the children who are relying on us. And if we are no longer being consistent, attentive, responsive, encouraging, and safe, we're going to start developing, or they're going to start developing, attachment trauma. Young children have difficulty understanding that what they see repeatedly on television or TikTok or wherever is not actually happening over and over and over again. They see it on the news. They hear their parents talk about it for days on end. They think it's still ongoing, and they may feel very anxious. They may feel very unsafe, because when my caregivers are unsafe, that must mean that I'm not safe. That must mean that whatever's going on means that I'm not safe. Young children may be indirectly traumatized by the caregiver's trauma. If the caregiver is completely overwhelmed, children, remember, tend to think egocentrically and personalizing and in all or nothing terms. So if the caregiver is suddenly absent or rejecting, the children may feel like they did something wrong and be traumatized. Emotionally, people experience mood swings. When we are stressed out, we tend to be more volatile in our emotions. That's normal. You're already primed with stress. It doesn't take much to blow the lid off or to overflow the bucket or whatever you want to say. Recognizing that, trying to take a break, take a breath before you speak can be really helpful. But communicating openly with those around you when you're feeling stressed, that, you know what, I'm feeling stressed right now. I'm feeling distressed right now. And I want to be here for you. And I need you to recognize that, I may be a little bit more moody right now. Sometimes we can't, there are a lot of times it's hard to, quote, control our moodiness because we are feeling so raw. Respecting that, not poking the bear, but being willing to give people their space or empathize with them and say, it seems like you're really struggling today. That can be, that speaks volumes to a lot of people. Hypersensitivity or sympathetic dominance. When we are in that stressed response, our bucket is already full. If you want to think of stress like water, our bucket is already full. So it doesn't take much more water added to that bucket to cause it to overflow. And because we're stressed, because we're noticing the threats in the environment, we're hypervigilant, it can be easier for us, again, to be more irritable, more volatile during this time. One of the things we can do is regularly be mindful of how we're feeling and regularly engage in downregulation activities. Slow your breathing, whether that's by singing really loudly, blowing bubble gum, blowing bubbles, square breathing. I don't care how you do it. Slow your breathing down. You can even massage right on the flap of your ear and right behind. That's where your vagus nerve, one of the places your vagus nerve comes to the surface. In order to trigger that vagus nerve and that relaxation response and start turning down the intensity of the stressors, so you are less easily triggered. People may experience grief. Remember, grief is denial, anger or anxiety, or both, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And people will bounce back and forth between those stages, and that's okay. But recognizing that, remember, we talked about all those losses, thinking about when this happened, what losses did you empathize with? Even if you didn't experience them yourself, what losses did you empathize with? Or what losses did you personally incur? And how are you going to grieve those? And in what way are you angry about them? A loss of a sense of safety. Well, I'm angry about that. So what am I going to do about it? Bargaining, depression, working through each of those in order to regain a sense of safety based on the facts in this context at this time. Anger and anxiety are emotions that are there to tell us, hey, you need to get off the couch and do something. They're not meant to be nurtured. They're meant to spur us into action so we can reclaim our safety and personal power. Survivor guilt is also common. Why them and not me? That is one of those existential questions. Maybe I should have put that under spiritual, but I didn't. That people need to recognize, because we may feel guilty that, hey, we get to have another Christmas with our loved one, and that family doesn't. Hopelessness and helplessness are other emotional reactions. And I want you to think about, in your friends, in your clients, in your coworkers, what do these reactions look like now? Helping people focus on what they can control right now is also very important. There's a lot they can't control. There's a lot they can't do. But what is it that they can do? Cognitively, people tend to fall into rigid thinking patterns when they're in fight or flight and disengaged from problem solving and all that stuff. They do it the way it's always been done. They perceive it the way it's always been perceived, that they're stuck in that it has to be this way. That's how I maintain control. That's how I keep it between the guardrails. It is not necessarily functional, but it definitely can... It definitely happens, and we need to recognize this is not the time for trying to, solve some big problem. We need to be as compassionate with ourselves as possible, and also consider getting other people's perspectives. If we're stuck, if, I'm in this box when I'm solving this problem and I'm not getting anywhere, okay, maybe I'm not going to get anywhere because I'm not able to get out of the box right now. Maybe I can ask somebody else who has a different box. We may tend to be more pessimistic and negative because we're noticing the threats, turning our attention to forcing ourselves to notice in our rich and meaningful life what is going okay right now, what things were not devastated by that tragedy. Ruminations and intrusive thoughts, that's your brain's way of going, I don't know what to do with this, so help me figure out what to do with this so we can file it away and we can feel safe and empowered. Examining those ruminations. What are they saying? All right. What is the validity to them and what do I need to do? If you continue to have ruminations, sometimes it can be helpful to write them down and put them in an envelope somewhere so you're not focusing on them. Other people will just thought stop. They're like, no, I'm not going to think about that right now. And they turn their attention to something else. Inability to concentrate and brain fog are both very common, both when you're stressed and when you're not getting good quality sleep. Being compassionate with yourself. If you get stressed because you can't concentrate or think clearly, it's just going to make it worse. So be compassionate with yourself. Write it down. Keep lists, make notes, and chunk your time. You may not be able to concentrate for 3 hours in a block right now. Okay, can you do 30 minutes? then what do you need to do? Environmentally, people may become hypervigilant, so help them turn their attention to what is safe and in what ways they are safe in their environment, and turn it off. And what I mean by that is social media. Get off of it. Get off of Twitter, get off of Facebook, get off of whatever, because that is going to stoke the fires. Spiritually, people experience a loss of meaning. They may be thinking, why am I here? What do I do with this? Because my perception of myself, others, and the world has been permanently altered. And I don't know, maybe I can't even achieve some of my dreams anymore. Why am I here? What am I supposed to do with this? Just because you didn't know someone or were not there doesn't mean you're unaffected by a tragedy. When you can easily see yourself or someone you love in harm's way, it triggers a natural stress reaction. Healing involves recognizing compassion and grief as normal reactions to horrific events, rebalancing your nervous system so you're not in constant fight or flight, evaluating your beliefs and reactions based on the facts in this context at this time, and identifying what is in your power now and which behaviors make good use of your energy. How does this, whatever happened, change my goals? And how can I refocus my energy on moving toward a rich and meaningful life instead of just stewing in this pot of anger? Thank you, everybody, for being with us and being patient with our little service blip. I will see you next week.